name's Wendy Harris. I work at Wellington International School, and I've come to talk to you a little bit about using LSAs in the classroom. I'm very well aware that we all come from different schools with different approaches and different resources, and the way that we work at Wellington may not be right for you, but it's not necessarily about the way we structure or what we put together. It's actually, hopefully, to give you some ideas about what to do with the LSA when they're in the classroom, because they're one of the most wonderful resources you can have, and sometimes one of the most underused resources. And to be able to use them effectively can enable the students in that class to make more progress. So that's what we're going to look at. First of all, it would be interesting if you have a think or talk to the person next to you or tell me, what do you think an LSA is? Maybe that's why you've come, because you think, what's that LSA thing? What do you think an LSA is? What is it in your setting? Any ideas? Would you like?
Learning support.
Yeah, learning support. Excellent. And I don't know how many of you use that term, but I purposely changed the term. When I went to Wellington, they used to use the term TA, which is teaching assistant, which in my eyes is a different kind of person. So I am talking about learning support assistants, and I think learning support assistants says exactly what they do. It is what it says on the tin. They are there to support the learning of the children in the class. That's their role. And one thing that we need to make very, very clear is the difference between the teacher and the LSA. And it's very hard to move forward in using your LSAs effectively if the roles are not clearly defined in the classroom. So the teacher is directly responsible for the students in that class. The teacher is responsible for the learning, for the progress, the data. They are their class and they are responsible. The LSA provides support to the teacher and through this to the students and to the teaching of the curriculum. They are there to support what is happening in the classroom. And that's two very clearly defined roles. And what you have to be very careful of is if you have a student who is being supported by an LSA and they go into the classroom and the teacher doesn't spend any time with that child because they have an LSA with them. And it's sometimes you get an attitude of, well, for us we call it the achievement centre. They're with the achievement centre. I don't have to worry about those children, I'll worry about the rest of the class. For us, that's not the right approach. The teacher does have to worry about that child, because if that child doesn't make progress, that is down to the teacher. It's the teacher's responsibility. The LSA is there to support as much as they can, kind of like always underneath, supporting the learning, supporting the teacher, supporting the student on what they're doing in the classroom. But they are not responsible. They are the support, and it's very important to make that very clear, because as you move on to how you use your LSAs, it's very important that the teacher understands what their role is when they have an LSA in the classroom. So I have to keep walking over there because I haven't got a clicker. And if I stand behind there, I'm a bit short and you won't be able to see me very well, and I'll be a long way away from you. So if we have effective practice with the LSAs, we hopefully end up, this is what it will look like, this is what we will get. First of all, we want the participation of the students in the social and academic process in the school. So it's about basically about the students belonging, joining in, being part of the school community. And that's inclusion. That's what inclusion is all about. And it's not just about the academics and getting them to make progress academically, it's also about that social side. Are they in the clubs? Do they work with students? When they're asked to get in a pair, do they get in a pair with the other students? How well does that happen? Does the LSA support with that? Are they included in that class? So fostering that participation in all areas of the school, that's what we want to see. And a good LSA will support and work with that. Probably for us in secondary, because I work in the secondary phase of the school, it's about enabling the student to be independent. And that's sometimes very difficult because some of our students are very, very clever, and they're very clever at getting LSAs to do what they want them to do and to do their work for them, because they're a bit tired today. And they're very, very clever students. And that's not actually doing them any good at all. Supporting them is enabling their independence. We don't want learnt dependence. They won't have an LSA sitting with them when they leave school. They have to work on their own. They'll have to find ways to manage, and that's what we will be fostering and helping them with all the time. So LSAs have to find ways to make those students become independent learners. If they ask a question, answer the question with a question. Don't necessarily tell them the answer. And they do get very frustrated. Sometimes they'll go, just tell me the answer. But actually you're getting them to find ways and find solutions for themselves all the time. And if your LSAs aren't doing that, then they may not be helping that child become independent. The child has to learn and do things by themselves. And ultimately, we want to raise the standards of achievement for all the students. And the LSAs in the class don't just have to help the students that they're assigned to, if they're assigned to particular students. They are a very, very useful resource in the classroom, and they can help lots of students. And we can take the whole class along and enabling further achievement and more progress for the group of students that they're working with. I don't know, again, many of you work in very different ways, but a lot of schools in Dubai, and our school did when I first went to Wellington, they used shadow LSAs. I don't know if you know what shadow LSA is and if that's the way you work. A shadow LSA is somebody that is employed to work with one particular student, and they're paid for by the parents, and they will follow that student around. And my first question when I came across this, when I first started at Wellington, was, does that make effective practice for the LSAs? And what I was seeing in our particular setting was that there was a lot of learnt dependence with the shadow LSAs. Students, because the LSA was with them all the time and following them around, that student has become very dependent on that LSA. I found it very hard to work without them. And I felt in some cases it was not doing the students any good, and we had to rethink the support that we were giving our students at Wellington to try and make it more effective. Just to give you an idea of what it looks like at Wellington, this is our structure of the way we work in inclusion. So we have a head of inclusion, we have what we call the Achievement Centre and the Achievement Centre Coordinator, and that's where all our SEN work comes out of. We have 15 LSAs and we have the subject teachers. That's the secondary phase of the school. The primary phase of the school reflects that, except they have more LSAs and more teachers because it's slightly bigger and they work slightly differently. But this is what it looks like. So it's the LSAs and the subject teachers that really, I think, do the most of the work. They do the groundwork down there. So we work like that. And we've changed the way that our LSAs are deployed within the classroom. So if we have a child on wave 3 level of support, which is our most needy level of support, if you like, they don't have a one-to-one LSA, they don't have a shadow LSA. What they do, they still, because we're a premium school, they still pay for their support, but they don't pay for an LSA that is their own. They pay for a level of support. So they actually pay slightly less than they would because the child isn't with them, the LSA isn't with the child all the time. And then what we do is try to make our LSAs specialists in faculty areas. So rather than following one child around all the time and having to know your maths, your English, your science, and all those other subjects that you go to, our LSAs stay where they are in their faculty areas and the children go to them. So we do have a lot of LSAs, and I do realise how lucky we are in that situation. But we have 3 in English, 3 in maths, 3 in science, 3 in humanities, 1 in the visual and performing arts, 1 in languages, and 1 in Arabic. And those LSAs are specialists in those subjects. And the longer they stay with me, the more specialist they become, because once they've done a year in the English department and they go and do another year, a lot of the things and the skills and the GCSE work that they're doing, they'll have done before. So their ability to work with that student and support that student as a specialist LSA becomes a lot more effective. We've also just started this year trying to upskill our LSAs in a different way, and we're having all our LSAs become specialists in a certain area of SEN. Now this is their own choice because they want to become more knowledgeable about what's happening, so they've all chosen an area. Well, I had to kind of help them a little bit because they all like doing dyslexia and things like that. We were trying to pan it out a bit, but they all have an area of SEN that they are going to upskill themselves on and then share with the other LSAs. Now, when we have a Wave 3 student, one of the LSAs will become their mentor. So although they don't have one LSA following them around all the time, they will have an LSA mentor that coordinates what they do. And so that LSA will probably become a specialist in the need of that child they're mentoring. So if the child they're mentoring is on the autistic spectrum, then they're going to have a look at that. And we will, as a school, we will support that. We will help them with the training. We also do a lot of in-house training, point them in the right direction for things to read and things to give them that information so that they can become more knowledgeable. And also to share that with the teachers when they're in their faculty areas, with the skills and the strategies that will help that child in the classroom. So hopefully it will help everybody, help the children get to where they need to be, and that's what it's all about. So even if you don't have a structure like that, and you might have one LSA, you might have 10 LSAs, you might, I don't know what it looks like, but in order to make your LSAs more effective, there's a few things that will really, really help. First of all, including the LSAs in the planning of the lessons. And that quote says it all. Dedicated planning time is essential if support is to be effective. Where LSAs have been seen to be included in the planning, the quality of the support is better and the outcomes are improved. So it's very important to encourage teachers in your school, or yourself if you are a teacher, to make sure you spend some time planning with your LSA. The other reason is, if you can imagine, I don't know how many of you are teachers, but if you're a teacher and you get put on cover, and you go into that cover lesson and nobody's left any work, it can be quite a scary situation. You have to think on your feet, well, what am I going to do with these children? How am I going to get them to learn? That's what it feels like for an LSA. Every single lesson, if they haven't been included in the planning process, they have no idea what's happening. So they're always on the back foot, and therefore their ability to be really effective has been minimised because it's much harder for them. It's also very important to include the LSA in your planning because you need to think about what they're actually going to do. So you've done this lesson. What is the role of the LSA in your classroom? Are they going to work with that particular child at that time because you know that skill they find difficult? And then they could go and work with this group of children because that's the thing that they find quite difficult. So if you've given all of that some thought before you start the lesson, you can see that that lesson is going to be more successful for a number of those students in that classroom. And the LSA will also feel empowered to help those students much, much more effectively. Obviously we have short-term planning, which is absolutely fine, having a conversation with the LSA, just making sure they know what they're doing before they go into the classroom, very important. Medium-term planning is much harder because it requires a conversation and some time. But this is another reason why we have our LSAs linked to faculties, because they can go to the faculty meetings, they can get their hands on the schemes of learning, they can talk to those teachers while they're sitting in the corridor or at break times, because they're there in that area with those teachers all the time. So although it can be quite difficult, if you plan it properly, the LSA, it is possible for the LSAs to be involved in that medium-term planning, and that will improve what they do. The other thing that can really work for you with your LSAs and help them to become more effective in the classroom is to find some feedback mechanisms with them. And the reason for that is that LSAs spend more time with those children than you do. They know those children very, very, very well. So if you talk to them about what happens in other lessons, or with a particular SEN need, so if they've been with a few dyslexic students, well, what worked with them? If you ask them about what works for those students, they can probably tell you. And if you ask them what doesn't work very well, they can probably tell you that as well. So if you start with that knowledge before you plan your lesson, you are saving yourself a lot of time, because you don't have to do the trial and error. You can actually plan the lesson effectively with what's been successful for the child somewhere else. So use your LSAs, communicate with them, and talk to them about what works for the students. That will really help them to be more effective. Now, when I say use your LSAs creatively and wisely, what I've done, and you can pick one of these on the way out if you're interested, don't feel you have to, but I just put together a takeaway sheet for you of lots of different ways that you can use your LSA. Different things that they can do from group work, different bits and pieces. So there's lots of ideas in here for you that you can take away and have a look at. Some of them will work for you, some of them you won't, but I hope somewhere in there you'll find a way to help you improve the practice. So try and think about it creatively. They don't always have to do the same thing. They don't always have to be in the classroom. They don't always have to be with the children that find it most difficult. They can be with the children that are actually finding it much easier and challenging those and pushing those forward. There's a lot of different ways that they can work. So obviously, because we haven't got much time, and I do like to talk and I could keep you here for ages, I'm not going to go through the worksheet, the help sheet, but you can take that with you and have a look. Now, the other thing that we've found that helps the performance of our LSAs is to value what they do. So at Wellington, we involve our LSAs in the performance management process. So they are all performance managed. And our performance management process looks like this. So in the autumn, that was just before the winter break, we observe all of our LSAs in the classroom. And now that's not that difficult, because obviously we do lots of classroom observations anyway. But to actually say to the LSAs, we are coming in specifically now to watch you and what you do in your practice. That actually means quite a lot to them, because sometimes they're never seen, nobody ever looks at what they do. So we go in and watch every single one of our LSAs. And then after that, which we're doing now, we set their targets. So we look at the observations, we look at what they want to do, we try and set targets that are involved in the faculty that they work with. Now they've got a new one with the SEN area that they want to develop their knowledge of. And then something that they are particularly interested in, maybe in school or in their own careers. So they have 3 targets, and that's what we work on now. When we've done all of those meetings and we've talked to each one of them, as a school, we put together some training for those. So we don't necessarily send them, it's not an expensive thing, I don't send them anywhere else. But from those targets and from those observations, we look at how we as a school can support the LSAs in improving their own practice. So if there were certain things like maybe we didn't see enough prompting and they weren't using the prompting techniques well enough in the classroom, then we would do an hour at lunchtime doing an in-school session to help them with that. And then it moves, so it's cycling, and then it moves on, and then we'll go and watch them again and see if they've improved, and then we'll look at new targets. So like all performance management processes, this is to help them move on and also to help them improve their own practice and their own careers if that's what they want to do. But ultimately, all of this is to help the students in the classroom. That's what we're all there for, and that's what the LSA is there for. And as I started with, I think they're one of the under-resourced, one of the most underused resources in the classroom. I really do think they are. And if we were a lot more creative, a lot more clever with what we did with our LSAs, and really use them in with the planning and the feedback, and valued them in their jobs that they would do, I think it would really benefit the students that are in the class that they're working with. And that's me done. Do you have any questions?
What would be the minimum requirements as far as experience in education for an LSA?
Our LSAs have to have at least an A-level or equivalent. But the LSA requirement goes through KHDA, so there is a KHDA requirement for their qualifications, but it's A-level or equivalent, and then those qualifications need to be cleared by KHDA. I don't. I often say I'd like experience, but some of my best LSAs have never had any experience. And a lot of my best LSAs tend to be parents of the children that are in school, because they've got some involvement in that, but also they just really want to help. And probably, maybe, if I went further than that, some of the best LSAs are the parents of the SEN children that are in school. But what we tend to do, if they've had no experience, I will always ask them to come in and shadow another LSA for a day. Come and see what it looks like, because some people have this kind of dream of working in a school and working in a club, this is what it's going to be like. And then when they come, it's not like that at all. It's a very different beast than what people think, I think. And you can either do it, you're either made for that kind of work, or you're not. That's my belief. So you come in for the day, and if they enjoy it, the other LSAs will give me some feedback, and then we'll give them a trial for a month. And sometimes those people have turned into my best LSAs. So it's always good to give people a go, I think.
Our LSAs are allocated certain students to work with. How do you encourage them to circulate around the classroom? And like you said, encourage that interaction and participation, because the student does become dependent on.
They absolutely do. And I agree with you, and that's always been an issue. I don't know were you here for the beginning of my talk when I said we don't actually have shadow LSAs anymore. We don't work like that. But I always have a rule that, as far as possible, do not sit down next to that child. Yes. Now I know that's not possible, but if that's what they're always trying not to do, rather than what they're always trying to do, it makes them a lot more thoughtful about what they're doing. If a child is actually working, so you've set them off and you're working, I'd always say to my LSAs, you've got to get up and walk around, leave them to it, and come back and have a look. You know, and it's just giving them those little tips about stepping away. See, if you see somebody else with a hand up, go and ask them. Let that child get on with it. Yeah, give them prompts, give them whatever they need to start, and it might be a slow process, because children are quite manipulative, clever. They'll get that LSA back because they want the LSA. But you've got to give the LSA those skills to move away. But it's giving them those little tips, I think, about thinking about where you are. If you're sat with a child through an entire lesson, personally, I don't think that's particularly helpful for that child. And even our children that have had the real needs, and we still have had children that have had a one-to-one because they're so needy, I don't want the LSA sat with that child all the time.
I find that a lot of students, like if the LSA does approach them, they're like, oh no, fine.
That's the other thing.
I don't know how to kind of stop that approach, because they're like embarrassed that they want to appear really.
But I think that's the other thing. I think with them moving away from the children that they work with all the time to becoming, because a lot of our LSAs are so in that class now that children will put their hands up and ask them rather than the teacher, because they're just there. They don't think about them as somebody that's to help that child, or you have to be not very clever. They don't think about that anymore because we've moved away from that culture. And they do think like that, particularly secondary, if they've seen an LSA sitting next to a particular child all the time, they don't want that LSA to come and help them because they feel, then you're right, they feel embarrassed. But that's not how it should be. The LSA is there as another adult in the classroom and another help. So it's changing that culture really. So the more they get up and step away and become part of the class, the more the children will allow them to help them. It's a bit of a process.
Yeah.
You've got to keep battling at it.
How do you support where LSAs work in specialist environments like a design and technology workshop, a scientific lab, where they're not necessarily them, but they're required to, students are required to use chemicals or machinery?
Well, I suppose it depends on the needs of the child, doesn't it? Because children's needs are different in different settings. So there might be some children that don't need any support anywhere else, but actually need it in those settings because they've got cerebral palsy, for instance, and they've got shaky hands and they can't do. So it does depend on the child how we would support in that setting. I don't really know how to answer that question. Because
yeah, no, it just occurred to me when I thought we have some, where I work, we have some specialist areas.
Yeah.
Along an LSA, I've worked there quite a long time, so I'm fine with them, but how does that work when you've got that child that's colourblind and you've got, buttons that stop on a machine, and when you've got chemicals that are there, and you've got the lady sort of rocks up, obviously you talk to her about it, and all of a sudden she's, she's sitting in an English classroom and all of a sudden she's surrounded by machines.
Well, I think that's where having the specialist LSAs come in, because our science LSAs, for example, are with the science department all the time. So they are, not all the time, but most of the time, obviously timetable restraints, they do go out elsewhere, but most of the time they're in science. So they get used to those experiments, and they would probably be able to tell you what they do with the children better than me, because they've been doing it. But that really helps when they're used to those environments and know what happens, and you see them helping set up the experiment and understanding what's happening. And that is one of the issues when you have to spread yourself around the school. How can you become a specialist in anything? You have to know everything about everything. So that kind of, having people in there more often might help. The same person in there more often might help.
I just want to ask something about going back to the question of qualifications and recruiting. Considering the minimal requirement for someone to come in and help, are they trained on ground, or you spend time before that? Do you train them, how specifically, how do you train them? How intensive training is, because if the teacher is not supposed to do trial and mistake, LSA shouldn't do that either. And if, more importantly, they shouldn't be either, because they're so close to the child. And also, how do they work with the parents? Are they involved into maybe collaborating with the teacher and the parent at the same time? IEPs, where else do they?
That's a huge question.
Yes, it's a lot of
questions.
So I'm going to
That's
ask
lots.
just the qualification. How much before that?
We train. So if we offer an LSA a job, we will then train them. So it's different. Again, it's like the children. They're all different. So it's different with different LSAs. But they will always spend some time shadowing other LSAs. When they start the job, they never go off on their own. They will shadow other LSAs, go around with them until
you know they're ready.
The LSAs know when they're ready, we'll know when they're ready, we talk to them, we mentor them, they've always got like a buddy. It's kind of the same as when you start a new school, you set them up with a buddy, they talk about it, somebody will sit down and go through the policies and procedures. So we do all of that. Luckily, well not luckily, but we have quite a big turnover, so they don't all start at the same time. So you can kind of spend time with each new LSA. But when we think they're ready, we will set them off on their own, and we won't do it until we know they're ready.
Is there
They're
any,
trying to get me to stop, aren't you?
No, it's okay. Is there any ratio like one LSA can handle a specific number of children? Suppose there are 3 or 4 students in a class and their needs are different. So how an LSA would like?
Well, we have a ratio of, if it's a wave 3, if we have wave 3 students, we say there has to be 1 LSA per 3 wave 3 students. That's quite high. And then for wave 2, it'd be 1 in 5. But it tends to be a lot less than that. That's our sort of, if we were really pushed and full, that would be the minimum support they would get. But we try as much as we can, if there's a wave 3 student in the class, that we'd put an LSA in there for each one. But what we don't want to do, again, is go back to this is your LSA. So you have to, and it also depends on the classroom, and that's why we don't need an LSA following them around. I'm a drama teacher. I don't have any LSAs in my classroom, and that's one time when the wave 3 students can have some real independence, and because they don't need it. Whereas if you had your shadow, they would go everywhere with them. Okay, I think I've got to stop now. That's fine, that's fine. Obviously you can come and ask me some questions. I'll leave my sheet here on the table if you want to pick one up on the way out. I've been asked to ask you to fill in the form that's sitting in front of you. before you go. Thank you very much for listening.